Life Management Science Labs would like to acknowledge that we live and produce this podcast on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people. We'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands of our listeners and our international colleagues. We'd like to thank and pay our respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Hi everyone, and welcome to On the House, the Household Management Science Insights podcast, produced by LMSL, the Life Management Science Labs. We are champions of life management science, providing structured insights informed by science and inspired by practice on key aspects of conscious living. Each week we bring you scientific and practical insights on each element, with expert knowledge from professionals in the field. I'm your host, Gabriella Joustra, coming to you from Naarm, Melbourne, Australia. Let's get started. Hello and welcome to the podcast. I'm Gabriella and I'm here today with Vergne Lehmann. So Vergne Lehmann is the Waste and Sustainability Officer at Yarriambiack Council, Shire. Hi, how are you?
Hi, I'm good, thanks.
Do you want to introduce yourself?
Vergne Lehmann, Waste and Sustainability Officer, Yarriambiack Shire Council.
Perfect. So we're going to start off today with asking you just a few rapid fire questions. So they're just to sort of get warmed up. What's your favourite food?
Favourite food? Curries. I love curries.
Yeah. What's your favourite home appliance?
My favourite home appliance? Probably my blender.
What book are you reading at the moment?
I'm reading a book on the food of the Singapore and Malay peninsulas, a cultural food history.
That sounds interesting. Have to get that afterwards off you. What was the last movie you watched?
Last movie I watched. Trying to think. The French Dispatch. Good
movie. What did you think of it?
I loved it, but I like Wes Anderson movies, so.
Is there a podcast that you really like at the moment?
Look, I'm a bit eclectic with podcasts. I bob around in all sorts of things. I like some economics ones like Freakonomics and Babbage, and then I'm also a bit of an archaeology nut, so I like to listen to different sorts of archaeology podcasts and history ones as well, so all sorts of things.
What was the last documentary you watched?
Last documentary. Look, I mean, documentaries, I'll watch anything by David Attenborough on any given day. I guess my favourite documentaries in recent time has been Craig Rucastle's War and Waste series, which I turn on periodically just to remind me why I have to do my job.
Mm-hmm. You recommend that for anyone listening to the podcast?
Yeah, absolutely. He does it in such a great style and visually gives the message around why waste is such a problem.
Okay. Do you have a role model that you admire?
Lots of them, actually. And I guess if, people like Costa Georgiadis, who I've worked with a little bit over the last few years in my job with bringing him out to our communities, and just the generosity of his time and his authenticity and his absolute inspiring enthusiasm for almost anything to do with, waste, sustainability, gardens, plants, you name it.
Do you have an app that you're using a lot at the moment or that you like?
The one I'm using a lot at the moment is the Vic Emergency app because of all the storms and things like that we've had. Look, the one I like using, I use the 1 Million Women app for measuring my environmental impact.
Oh, I haven't heard of that app. I'll have to have a look at that. And are you using any particular news websites?
I generally use the ABC for most news.
Mm-hmm. And have you been to any events recently?
Like most people, not too many. We had a couple up around our way in the last weekend, which were great to see people at. The Horsham fishing competition was on, and There was some enduro racing. Not that they're my thing necessarily, and I didn't get to the one at Rainbow, but it's just great to see that people are able to get back to events again after the last couple of years and start interacting and enjoying each other's company and just being able to see different people.
Mm. Yeah, I can't wait to start going to events myself. We're next going to go into just a sort of a practice that you do. So what's something that you do to manage waste in your own home?
So one of the things I do, and I set this up when I redid my kitchen a little while back, is having a waste sorting station. So it means I sort my recycling and all the other bits and pieces. So one of the issues for me is I don't have a curbside collection because we live on a small farm property, but it doesn't really matter because there's a lot of your recycling that you can put into your generally yellow lidded mixed recycling bin. There are some councils now that also have glass bins, and some have food and garden organics bins as well, along with your landfill bin. But so that means you do have to sort those things out. But I sort them out because when we take it to our local transfer station, I can put our plastics in a plastics container, glass goes into a particular glass container. But there's lots of things like in the town I live in, the Lions Club collect paper and cardboard. So I bundle that up and drop that into them. Things like batteries or any e-waste has to be separated out from your rubbish these days, and they get dropped off at the transfer station as well, or at council offices and things like that. Some hardware stores take them as well. Same with light globes. I separate out my aluminium foil and put it in a little ball so it can go into the metal collection more easily. I collect up bread tags and rubber bands and things like that in jars, because some of those sorts of things, particularly the bread tags, go to a community charity that collects them up for creating wheelchairs for children. Soft plastics can't go into recycling, but they can be collected up and dropped off at supermarkets like Coles and Woolworths, and they go to a company called Replas who make recycled plastic benches and bollards and all sorts of things. Food waste, because we do live on a property, we do have chickens and dogs and things like that. So I don't have too much food waste, but whatever can't be used for them goes into our composting system. We also have a worm farm. And that includes our coffee grounds. Eggshells I collect up and they're crushed up and go into our garden. We grow some of our veggie scraps, like, I take the bottom off a bok choy or tops off carrots and they can be regrown. I grow avocado seeds because they actually make really nice indoor plants. So there's all sorts of things that I do with my recycling station that perhaps is a little bit more than the usual household, I suspect.
It sounds
But
like yeah,
it's
sorry.
about sort, as I say, it's all about sorting.
It sounds like there's a lot of it seems like you'd have to have a lot. You'd have to be very organized for that. So do you have like a jar for this and a jar for that and a box for this and a box for that?
Yeah, I do. I have a set of bins that stack up so that I have, my waste at the top. Then there's plastics and tin cans recycling. Then there's soft plastics, and then there's paper and cardboard. I have a special bin for glass, and then I have another tub which is full of little jars and things where I collect up all the other bits and pieces. And look, you have to set it up. But once you've got it set up, it's pretty simple to actually just pop the things into the right things. It's all in one location. It's, as I said, I call it my little waste station. And it just means that I'm organised all the time and I don't have to worry about, once it's in its location, all I have to do is get it to the transfer station or the drop-off point for those things. And it's a relatively simple process. But yes, you do have to be a little bit organised.
Okay, so I guess the best thing to do is to get it all set up, and then once it's set up, it's actually very easy.
Yeah, and the other thing is understanding where things have got to go and how you can deal with them. I mean, for me, it's all about reducing what waste we produce. So, at that point, the decisions on purchasing that I've already made will already decide what amount of waste I'm producing. So it's then a matter of, what can I do things? So I have a coffee maker, I have coffee grounds. What can I do with coffee grounds? And there's lots of things you can do with coffee grounds, for example. Whether it be putting them in your compost or on your plants that a lot of people use. I've got a friend that makes soap and uses coffee grounds in her soap making. You can make coffee scrubs out of them with, mixing with a bit of oil, olive oil, and raw sugar or brown sugar. And you can make a really nice coffee scrub for your skin. So there's lots of things you can do if you're prepared to. I mean, I guess I'm a bit of a waste nerd, so I go and look for those solutions so that I'm not putting things into landfill I don't need to.
Well, that's why you're here. Um, are there any challenges for this?
Look, I guess the challenge is, you've got to create some space to do this in. As I said, you've got to be a bit organised there, and you've also got to do a little bit of research and make sure you know where you can put these things. There's not much point in collecting up things to recycle if they cannot actually be recycled. So unfortunately, there are things that are recyclable but not easily recycled, and that makes some of those things challenging. And a good example of that is things like polystyrene, absolutely recyclable. The problem is that it's so light. Unless you've got a place nearby that you can recycle it at, it's hard to justify recycling, because if you put a truckload of polystyrene where I live, which is about 300 kilometres from Melbourne, set it down to Melbourne for recycling, which is where a lot of the recycling actually has to go, you're transporting air. So it's as much as we want to do the right thing, if we don't have the facilities to do that, it's just not possible all the time.
Mm. And so you're also talking about having to take it down to the transfer centre. So do you have to make time for this? Yeah.
Yeah. So most towns, communities, all councils run transfer stations, or they contract someone to run transfer stations for them. I call them transfer stations. Most people probably know them as the local tip. And they're often on a road called Tip Road. It's where a lot of the waste activity goes. So when you do a household clean up and you've got to take a trailer load of rubbish, that's where you take it. And they separate things out there. In rural areas like the one I live in, there are some people like us that don't have a curbside service, so we've got to manage our own waste and we have to drop it in there. So you have to know when the tip or transfer station is open, and you take it in then, and they depending on I don't get charged for my recycling. Because I have it all nicely sorted out. But yeah, there are obviously charges if you're going to dump other things.
Why do you think home administration is important?
Well, I guess to me it's about being organised in your life. Otherwise, it's just chaos. So you've got to have systems in place in your own home. In the same way as when you go to work, you have systems for working. It's if you get your bills, you've got to pay them. You've got to go through that process. You've got to do your purchasing, in a workplace it's procurement. So at home it's purchasing, and you have your routines to do that. You've got to make sure that everyone's got clean clothes and things like that. It's about making sure you've got your energy and power bills paid, so you've got those things happening. So it's about the smooth running of your life. And the easier, the more routine you have on those sorts of things, the less likely you are to have problems over time. So, whether it's maintaining appliances or, looking after things around the home, making sure things are clean, all that sort of stuff, it's just about making your life a little bit easier. I think, and that's what it comes down to, and that gives you time then to go and enjoy the things that you really want to do.
Mm. And how does waste management come into that?
So waste management, one of the reasons why I got into waste in the first place is really because it's the one thing that we all have to get involved in some way, shape or form. We all produce waste, whether we like it or not. And what I like about it is that it has impacts in so many areas in our lives. So it has a cost impact. It costs there's no such thing as a free lunch. There's no such thing as free waste either. There is a cost to dealing with waste. It's also resources, because not all, I don't like the word waste, because they are just materials that we no longer have a use for. A lot of the things, when I talk about my waste station, I really should call it my resources station, because there's a whole lot of resources in there that now can go, because I've got it sorted out properly, can go into being, to producing other things, whether it be recycling or upcycling or remaking, repurposing, all those sorts of wonderful RE words that mean that those things will have a continuing life in some form. There's obviously an environmental impact on waste. If you don't manage it properly, you end up with problems, litter problems in the environment, or landfill issues where you can end up with landfill fires if it's not managed properly. So there's all sorts of things there that really make waste important in our lives, and it's important in the home as well, because if we manage it properly, first of all, we all get the benefit of having, in the longer term, having more resources at our disposal to manufacture or remanufacture. So we're not using virgin materials all the time. And we reduce the environmental impact on our purchasing. What it really comes back to is we produce waste based on what we buy. And if we get the buying part right, then we can get the waste part right a lot more easily.
So you're saying that you need to change your buying habits to sort of try to reduce the amount of waste you're producing?
Yeah, look, governments talk a lot about recycling and all that sort of stuff. In fact, it would be much better, and I know governments will be reluctant to say this because they don't want to impact on the economy too much by saying to people, don't buy so much rubbish, so to speak. If people bought more wisely, and this is what I talk about, think about your purchasing. So when you go to the supermarket, my husband always wonders why it takes me so long to do our shopping. It's because I'm reading labels these days. One of the things that I think about a lot is, is this product using recyclable packaging in the first instance? So can that packaging be recycled? There are a lot of composite materials now that make, particularly in things like dog and cat food, those are things that look like soft plastic but have a foil lining, chip packets, things like that. Can't be recycled easily. They are recyclable, but they're expensive to do that. So it's not easy to do those sorts of things. Whereas if you choose versions that, if you buy your cat food in a cardboard box, sure, that's easy to recycle. The other thing I now look for, because in the last probably a year or two, couple of years in particular, a lot of the big companies who produce most of the cleaning products around the world, and there's only 2 or 3 of them really, are now committed to using recycled material in their containers. So they're now happy to say on their labelling that this is a 100% recycled plastic bottle. And it can be recycled again, not forever, but it can be recycled many times before it's a problem. So I look for those things that have those options. We'll also see some other options. I see there's a lot of talk about being able to do refills on certain things as well. So, your dishwashing liquid, instead of having to buy a new product, a complete new container. You can take your refill bottle and things like that. And there are some smaller scale things like that already happening out there. But I think we'll start seeing a lot more of those sorts of things in the big supermarkets as well. So that's what I mean by, thinking about your purchasing. That's at that level. When you're talking about things like appliances, for example, check whether they have take back. Can you take your old one back? Mattresses is another good one like that. Will they take, if you're buying a new $2,500 mattress, can you take your old one back? Will they pick that up when they deliver it for you? With your washing machines, fridges, and so forth, are there take back programs? There certainly are in computing. Because the thing with a lot of these items is that we might see it as just a bit of rubbish, but in fact there's a lot of very valuable materials in them. There's also some dangerous ones as well that we don't want people fiddling around with. But things like copper and other wires and so forth, there's some good stuff there that can be taken out of it and reprocessed into the future. So think about those things. Think about whether something can be repaired. Going back to my parents' and grandparents' day when they first got a TV, if it broke down, you called the TV repairman and they came out and they fixed your TV. Now, it's a different type of TV these days, but these days if your TV breaks down, you throw it out and you go and get another one. So think about, are there products out there that you can easily fix? And there is a big movement around the world, what they call a repair movement, to ensure that particularly high-tech companies, mobile phones, will allow you to get your item repaired at a reasonable cost without impacting on warranties and things like that. So there's lots of things out there that when you're making those decisions to purchase something, if you just do a bit more checking into what are those options around repair and return and the packaging of those items, a little bit more care in that area means we reduce a lot of our waste.
And what happens if you already have the broken TV that you can't repair?
In that case, in certain states now, there's a lot of e-waste legislation now. So, for example, in Victoria, you cannot put that into landfill. You have to take it to usually the transfer station or somewhere like that. But it can be returned. And again, there are companies that are processing that material now, and will fix. We'll pull apart all the different materials and ensure that what they can recycle, they will. So that's a good thing. That's something that the state governments have been progressively bringing in recent times. So none of that stuff is allowed to go into landfill any longer.
Okay, I'll have to keep that in mind for next Hard Rubbish Day. And what are some misconceptions about waste management in our society?
Look, I think the biggest misconception about waste management is that there is a place called away. We throw things away. There is no away. It's got to go somewhere. And this is why I say it's important that people think about purchasing, because it's those things that will be going, away when you throw it out. So, we have landfills, but we want to reduce our reliance on having landfills. We can't keep digging holes in the ground and chucking stuff in there as if that's the solution for everything. First of all, it's not how we should be treating the earth. It's not cost effective. At some stage, people will want to use that land down the track once you finish with that landfill, and we already know that these can cause significant issues. If you look to build housing developments, 2 or 3 decades later, you can have significant issues with methane gas and so forth, particularly if you've got organic wastes in there as well. So there's a lot of there's a lot of reasons why we want to do that. And to be quite honest, we should be smarter. I mean, think about it. Somebody goes to all the trouble to produce good food, for example, whether it's a farm or a food processor or whatever, we throw out around about 30% of all food that's produced around the world does not get consumed. A lot of it gets thrown out. So we're throwing out somebody's hard work there, only for it to be a real problem down the track because we haven't dealt with it properly. Now, I mean, food waste is something I'm certainly very passionate about. We can reduce that. There's a lot of ways we can go about reducing that. And that comes down to buying properly, buying the right quantities, understanding what it is we need. Don't overbuy. Storing it properly, make sure if it needs to be refrigerated, it's refrigerated. If it's getting close to the date where you've got to use it by, consider, freezing things. Not all fruit and vegetables should be stored in the fridge. Some things are better not stored there. So just, understanding those sorts of things and not just willy-nilly throwing things out. It can be challenging because if you're a single person, for example, or even a couple, it's really hard to buy things that are small quantities without buying a lot of already packaged processed food. So if you want fresh food, that can be quite challenging at times. I mean, just buying a loaf of bread. I know some companies now are making half loaf sizes, which is great. But, when I had 6 teenage boys at home, a loaf of bread was nothing. That was gone in an afternoon. But, it's not the same for every household. So, making sure that you manage your food so you're not throwing things out is really important. But that, there's no way for that. So, if it goes into landfill, it will degrade in there over time, and that's where we get greenhouse gas emissions, and we know landfills produce a lot of greenhouse gas emissions, and that's one of the areas that state governments are looking to reduce their reliance on in order to ensure that we meet our climate change targets. So that's part of it, but it's respecting the product so that it's not thrown out.
So do you have any tips for like buying smaller quantities or like how to manage the food better?
Yeah, look, I think the easiest thing is if you can't buy in smaller quantities on your own, consider sharing with somebody else. So, if you don't a loaf of bread, for example, if you can't buy a smaller loaf, do you know someone you could both, you share the bread rather than that? Or alternatively, you can freeze bread quite easily, so it's not a huge problem from that perspective. Be aware of how much you're actually using and eating. And I mean, we always have a scraps bucket so that I can see exactly how much we might waste because there is some waste that is unavoidable. I mean, taking, when you're chopping up your veggies and things, just be careful around how much you purchase is the main thing, and make sure you read storage instructions on them. So if something's got to be in the fridge, make sure it's in there. And think about your veggies. Things like tomatoes don't need to be in the fridge. They, in fact, they go better without being in there. And there are some fruit and veg that should never be stored together. So because of the ethylene gas that they give off. So bananas should never be refrigerated, for example, either, because they tend to go black. So understanding what you're buying, I think, is really important. If you make, I often make things like a curry where I know it's going to be too much for one meal, so I put some aside and freeze it and have it later on. It's great for if you're home late one night and you need a quick meal. So think about those sorts of things that just make life a little easier as well. Again, it comes down to, household management and being a bit organised.
Mm. So moving on to a slightly different topic. So some studies have found that inadequate waste management systems lead to illegal dumping, littering, or mixed waste. Is there something that we can do about that?
Yeah, look, one of the challenges in any waste management system is it costs money. So let's be clear, there's no free waste. And one of the reasons why we end up with things like illegal dumping is because people decide they don't want to pay for it. So how do you manage that? Now, one of the ways they do that is by having a levy placed on some goods before when you buy them. So things like TVs, computers, tyres, paint. When you buy paint these days, there's I think it's only a few cents, 5-10 cents or something like that. But that all goes into a fund that looks after the management of that as waste, as long as you take it to the right places. And that just makes life a little bit easier for the cost of managing waste. If you don't have those schemes, you have the problem of, mattresses are a great example. Mattresses are the bane of any landfill manager's life because they act like surfboards. They rise to the top and they sit there. They're a real problem to deal with in landfill. But they're also full of good stuff that you can recycle. But there's a number of different components there, so they do have to be pulled apart. So you have the fabric, you have the steel springs, you have wood. There are things in there that can be reused and recycled into new products. But people, it's interesting. People are happy to spend a couple of $1,000s on a nice new mattress, but they'll argue about spending $25 or $30 on getting rid of it, the old one, at the transfer station. But that's what it costs to take them apart. So if you had a levy on top of any new mattress that would pay for all of that, then you'd get around that problem. And as I said, that's what they do with things like paint now. They've done it with TVs and computers for a few years. So there is there's money there to deal with it at the end of its useful life, allowing the recovery of those materials. Tyres are another one. But there are these schemes do have to be well managed because otherwise you can end up with some unintended consequences of, and we've seen this with tyre dumps and things like that, where they're taken back and just dumped and left. And of course they pose a hazard to local communities if they start fires, for example. You can end up with some significant problems there, and that certainly has been the case in recent years. So again, it's about managing those things properly. Litter is an ongoing issue, and anyone that drives down any of the major roads around the country will see litter everywhere, and it's not hard to work out what most of it is. It's mostly food, takeaway food waste and wrappers and packaging. That's a consequence of our reliance on convenience in our lifestyle. So the way that governments are now starting to look at tackling some of this is by having bans on single-use plastics, because if they're thrown out, unless they're picked up, they'll sit there and become a hazard for wildlife. They just, plastic will break down into microplastics and end up in soils and waterways and things like that. Really, we just don't want people to throw things out the window of their cars. Go and find a bin. Always make sure you've got a rubbish bag in your car that you can put those things into and get rid of them when you get home. But that's the littering problem. That throwing of coffee cups is another one. We seem to be really good at creating new forms of waste. I mean, 30 years ago, who would have thought we'd have problems with single-use coffee cups? We just weren't that. We liked our coffee, but we weren't fanatics about our coffee like we are these days. And you walk down the streets of our major cities, and there's people wandering around everywhere with a coffee cup in their hand, and it's a single-use coffee cup. Now, pre-COVID, there was a lot of work being done to get people to use their own cups or have cup exchanges and things like that. But once COVID hit, a lot of that sort of stuff went out the door again because people were worried about infection spreads and things like that. Hopefully now that we're sort of seeing the light at the end of the COVID tunnel, we'll come back to a little bit more of that, washing cups or taking your own and that sort of thing, so that we can reduce that sort of waste around the place. Going back to the Craig Rucastle War on Waste, he filled a Melbourne tram with coffee cups to demonstrate how big a problem the coffee cup issue is. So, it's one of those things. Unless you see a really great visual like that, it's hard to imagine that one little cup of coffee that you had makes that much difference. On its own, no, but when you've got hundreds of thousands of people doing this every day, it starts to add up.
Something that I've noticed, since COVID started was there's a lot of masks on the ground, like reusable and disposable masks, and they're obviously going to create a huge hazard. Other than, collecting them and maybe disposing of them properly, is there anything else we can do?
Yeah, look, and again, this is, unintended consequences and all these sorts of things. Once we want people to wear masks, or certainly they've had them mandated at various times, and people have worn the disposable ones. Again, it comes down to personal responsibility. People have got to dispose of them properly. Don't just, and you're right, they're everywhere. I mean, you go into a car park, you see them, next to when you're stepping out of a car, on the roadsides, in parks and gardens and things like that. They're just all over the place, and in gutters, they can, they just need to be placed in the bin. They're not easily recycled. Because of, again, the different componentry of them. And, again, people are concerned about picking them up because you don't know who's worn them. So you've got those, the infection control issue there as well. So it's a bit challenging. But again, I have to say to people, you put your coffee cup in a bin, put your mask in a bin. Just put it in the right bin. And another consequence out of COVID has been, now that we have the rat tests they can't be put into recycling. Unfortunately, they've got to be disposed of properly as well. So it's about making sure that people put them in the right places.
So you just say general waste bin is the best for both of those?
Yeah. Look, if in doubt, put it in. Having just spent the last while telling you I don't want people to put things into their landfill bin, sometimes that's just the best place for them, unfortunately. It's just a fact of life. We don't want people putting things into recycling that shouldn't be going into recycling.
What happens when you put something that's not supposed to be in the recycling?
Well, one of the things I would recommend, if any, and you can probably look at them on YouTube, but if you ever have the opportunity to go and visit a recycling place, they're called MRFs. That's a material recycling facility. Like most professions, the waste profession loves acronyms as well. And what you see these days is that there's a lot of technology associated with sorting things. So everyone has their mixed recycling bin. They get dumped out in a recycling centre. It goes on a series of conveyor belts, and magnets will pull out the steel for recycling. They have trommels which will take the lightweight papers and plastics out, and things get sorted quite quickly through that kind of that mechanisation of this. So you haven't got lots of people sitting there picking through everyone's waste to pull it out. The one thing I would say, if you're not sure if something should be recycled, just really check on your council websites. They will tell you exactly what can be in there. As a general rule of thumb, the things that go into your recycling bin are mostly packaging. You can't put textiles in there. You can't put old shoes in there. You can't put batteries and things like that in there. It's mostly the packaging around the food, the food area of your home, the kitchen, and the laundry and bathroom. That's where most of our waste is generated in the home, in those three areas. And it's mostly around the packaging that is associated with them. So if you keep that in mind, it's not hard to get it right. But it's and there is some recycling labelling done these days. It's a standard in Australia. Doesn't quite work everywhere, but it gives you a pretty good idea. If it's soft plastics, keep it in a soft plastics bag and drop it in the supermarket. Any cardboard, any hard plastics, glass, tins, aluminium can all be recycled into your recycling bin.
So, in my own research, I thought that I heard that a lot of plastics can't be put into the recycling. So, not just soft plastic, but a lot of other plastics. Is that true in Australia?
Yeah, look, plastics is a real challenge. People will you'll look on most plastic items and you'll see a little triangle. People think that means recycling. In this case, it's actually the international symbol of plastics, and it's got a number in there. And there are certain plastics that are more easily recycled than others. Now, fortunately, a lot of the more difficult ones are not so common anymore. And I can't quite remember the ones that you can and can't put in there, but it's not hard to find out. But the plastics 1, 2, and 3 are generally easily recycled, and you can pop them in there in the recycling bin without too much trouble. The more what I'd call exotic plastics are the ones that there is a problem with.
We sort of already gone over this a little bit, but how can we practice home waste management at home?
Well, again, it starts from purchasing. Think about what you're purchasing. Try and make sure that what you are purchasing can be recycled if it's got packaging. If you can buy unpackaged things, take your own containers or bags and things like that for vegetables. So I have some very lightweight netting bags that I can use for fruit and vegetables. So I don't have to use those lightweight plastics that are provided by the supermarkets or fruit and veg shops and so forth. Things like bananas, you really don't need to put them in a bag. They've got a perfectly good packaging. It's called their skin. So if you pick up a hand of bananas or 2 or 3 of them, I've never felt the need to actually have them in a bag. So think about those sorts of things. As I said, the type of packaging that something does have to have packaging, well, then it has to. But if you can find or think about options that actually don't have the packaging, so avoiding the waste in the first instance is always the best one. Ultimately, when you're shopping beyond the basic necessities of life like food and cleaning products and so forth, think about, do I really need this? I always have this rule of thumb that if there's something I particularly like, I'll say if it's there in a week's time, then it's meant to be mine. That's served me reasonably well over the years, because if I've gone back, it's not there, I've saved money, and I probably didn't really need it. But, think about those sorts of things. Think about other options for purchasing as well, as in not purchasing but borrowing or whatever. So there are things like tool libraries these days, toy libraries, book libraries we've had for a long time. You don't have to buy everything, and you don't have to buy everything new either. So, there are other options that are often available in different through different community groups. Things like, drills, for example. A lot of households will have one, but they're rarely used. You can go to a tool library and pay a small fee to use theirs, or they might have a membership subscription type process. You don't actually have to own it. So think about those sorts of things, about, whether you need to own those things. There's some fantastic stuff with children these days, with toy libraries and even, stuff for babies where you use it for the period of time that you need it and then you take it back again. I guess another one on the subject of babies is that age-old one around nappies. Look, going back to the 70s, 80s and early 90s, we went big on disposable nappies because it was so much easier, wasn't it, than having to deal with cloth nappies. Well, we've kind of swung around now because disposables are not cool anymore by any stretch of the imagination. And they've managed to look at how to design cloth nappies to be a far more, I guess, user-friendly item these days. So, and there are a number of councils now that are actually doing trials or helping people with babies to move to a more sustainable cloth nappy version rather than the disposable all the time. That's important because as councils progressively move to having food and garden organics bins, they're often saying to people, to their residents, we don't want to collect your landfill bin every week. We would like to collect it every fortnight. And the one thing that is always a complaint about that is nappies, because nobody wants to hold on to disposable nappies that have been used for a couple of weeks. They want that collected every week. So, those are the sorts of things that when we look at changing our services to improve it, and I know, they're talking about 4 bins these days with, a landfill, a mixed recycle, glass and food and garden organics, and that might not be what everyone wants. They might only have a small dwelling and that's going to take up a bit of space. But the more we can do that separation, the better the outcomes are at the end. So that's where that's heading. But it also means you're not going to have rubbish services every week necessarily. The council I work for is we're introducing a glass bin later on this year, and what we're doing is instead of having fortnightly mixed recycling pickup, we'll have it on a 4-week cycle. So it's one fortnight it'll be glass, the other fortnight it'll be mixed recycling. Councils have got to manage their costs as well, so it's a matter of how we balance up customer service with the costs that are associated with running these kind of services, and making sure that ratepayers aren't unfairly charged when we don't need to. So those are the sorts of things that are important there. So that gets you around the sort of purchasing of things, thinking about what you're buying, and then, as I've said, have an area where you can sort your rubbish. You don't have to go to the lengths that I go to, but if you can sort things into glass, mixed recycling, paper, cardboard, if you've got the opportunity to dispose of them through different services, e-waste and things like that. So your batteries, light globes, anything with a cord or anything that can take a battery is what e-waste is generally. So I have a bag for putting those sorts of things into. I also have an op shop box as well. So if there's clothing that I've decided I no longer need but is still perfectly good, then I have a box of things that can be taken to a local op shop. Just remember, when you're taking things to a local op shop, though, if you wouldn't wear it yourself, then it's unlikely that anyone else will. So don't take things that are ripped and stained and all that sort of stuff. They don't need that, and they've got to pay for that waste management if people drop off rubbish to them. So only take things that are actually useful for them. It's important. They're a charity, and we want to make sure that they're using their funds to their best ability on that score. So that's, those are the sorts of things there. So, it's really a matter of, looking at how you purchase things, look at other options. Do you need to purchase? Can you borrow? Look at the type of packaging, look at whether you can repair, all those sorts of things, and then how you sort it out at home. And I think if you get those sorts of things right, if you get that process right, then it makes life a whole lot easier. And you'll save quite a bit of money too, I might add.
Okay. Well, everyone wants that, I think. And so our last section is the audience questions. So I'll just check how much time we've got left. Got a couple more minutes. So we'll do a couple of the questions. And then I'll also maybe get you to speak on something that you're passionate about. What is the difference between compost, recycling, and landfill?
So composting is for organic materials. So that's, your food scraps, your garden waste and so forth. There are some, we talked about not putting meat in there, but, your plant veggie scraps and those sorts of things. Um, is what you put into compost, and that compost can then, you create the compost, you turn it over, you make sure that it's aerated and that it doesn't get sloppy and stinky. You make sure that it's got the right mixes of browns and greens and so forth. I won't get too technical about it, but it's basically making a new product that you can put back into your garden to grow more plants and fruit and vegetables and things like that. So it's very much a recycling of organic material. What was the other two? It was landfill and recycling.
Landfill and recycling.
Okay, landfill is basically the end point for waste. It's where when it goes there, it goes nowhere else. It's generally in a hole. It's put in there and it's covered over, and progressively over time, once it's filled, that's it. That's the end of its life. Recycling is basically taking materials and making new material, new product or new packaging out of them. So, your paper can be recycled. Many of the plastics are easily recycled. Glass, aluminium, tin can all be reused again. So it makes sure that those, when we've dug them up out of the ground originally, whether it be through petroleum for making plastics or iron ore for steel cans, bauxite for aluminium and so forth, we get more than one use out of them. We don't have to continually use virgin material. So it allows those things to remain in the system through recycling. Recycling is not just putting things in the right bin, it's actually doing something with it beyond that. So that's the difference between those three. So composting and recycling are similar in that they are a recycling process. They're just for different types of materials.
So another question is, can I burn my my waste? So garden waste or plastic waste?
Well, first of all, certain depends on the council and the time of the year. So, for example, at the moment we have fire restrictions on through a lot of parts of the state. So you can't burn anything at the moment without a permit. Look, burning, it's not a great way of dealing with waste. It also can be quite dangerous. If it's a suburban backyard, not ideal. I mean, once upon a time, we used to do a lot more of that. Most councils probably won't allow you in a suburban area to burn anything much in your backyard anymore. So I would say it's definitely not a good option. We talk about burning waste at a larger scale through what we call waste to energy. But that's a highly controlled process that mostly the Scandinavian and Northern European countries do quite a bit of to create energy, what they call energy from waste. It goes into their electricity grid, but that's industrial scale kind of stuff, not burning in your backyard. And I guess the short answer is there. Probably no from a council permission perspective, but not ideal in any case.
Okay. Any tips on how to get kids involved in waste management?
Look, most of the schools have fantastic programs these days that deal with a lot of this sort of stuff. It's certainly within their curriculum. There's the Resource Smart Schools program. There's Eco Schools. There's a few of those sorts of things. I've certainly been involved in delivering some of those in schools, and I have to say the kids take it up with gusto. They love it, and they go home and they spread that message because they love to be able to say to their parents, "No, Mum, you're not doing the right thing with your recycling. You've got the wrong thing there." So they love to be involved and they love to understand what it is that you're doing, and it gives them some purpose there, and get them involved in doing that in the home. When you're setting up your waste station, make sure the kids are involved in maybe get them to design the waste station for you so that they do all the labelling and little, put the plastics here or whatever it is, and get them. You can even create. My kids are all grown up now, but what I used to do is have a box where all crafty stuff would go. So things that during holidays when we wanted to do crafts, we'd have a craft box, and again that gets a lot of those things will be cardboard boxes and things like that, and bits of fabric and so forth. So it's just a way of getting them to collect those sorts of things if you've got kids that are that way inclined. But yeah, kids are great sponges with these sorts of things, and it's certainly when I'm looking to deliver waste education in our community, I always have an element of delivering to schools and early kinder now is we try and get those messages in there as early as possible. Make it fun, though. That's the thing with kids. Make it fun.
Yeah, I definitely learnt a lot as a kid, but I think my parents I never got involved in it, so I never really started doing it until I left home. Are there any other sort of topics you want to talk about?
Look, I guess, one of the things that I mentioned a little earlier I'm really passionate about is food waste, and some of the things that we can do a lot better there. I look back in history and look to understand, when we go back and look at how people used to manage things, because you've got to remember we didn't always have curbside collections of food and things, or garbage at all. And, when we look back in time, you look back in the old cookbooks and the Mrs. Beatons and things like that, they had so many wonderful tips in there about how to manage your household. And, talked about how you reduce your waste and how you, saved energy, for example, or, made sure that you didn't waste so much food to cook to portions. And, remember, of course, that in those days, in the 1800s, they didn't have electricity either, so they didn't have refrigeration. They understood how to store things without having the modern appliances that we do, and there's some wonderful research that's been done around storing of fruit and vegetables and things without necessarily using refrigeration that mean that we've lost those sorts of those arts, that oral tradition of passing down from usually mother to daughter. It shouldn't necessarily be that way these days, but there's some really interesting stuff around that, and that's I'm probably a frustrated archaeologist at heart, but one of my favourite books is a book called Rubbish Theory, by it's actually an archaeologist, Michael Thompson. So he developed this rubbish theory back in the 1970s. It's the creation and destruction of value. And what he did with his archaeology students, over a period of about 20 to 30 years, he was in an American university. He was looking for ways in which they could practice being archaeologists, collecting information and working out what was happening. And they did it by going to landfill sites and by looking in people's garbage bins. So it was about creating what's the narrative out of those what's in those garbage bins. And one of the things that they picked up, for example, was they would survey people and say, how much alcohol have you drunk? And then they would go and look in garbage bins, and probably no surprise, people underestimated the amount they were drinking by about 50%. And they could prove that because they were able to look at the alcohol that was in their garbage bins. They were also able to see where there were different cultural enclaves, for example. So they could tell where there were a lot of Latin American people living, because they could tell by the type of food waste they had in their bins, and it consisted of a lot of bones, which more, I guess, Anglo-Americans didn't tend to have in their rubbish. So it was really use this whole program of going through waste to, and mostly food waste at that, to really understand what was going on in the community and in society and the changes that were going on with how we consumed over time. And I've always found that fascinating, and I've written a couple of pieces on that based on the work that Thomson did back in the sort of 70s and 80s and so forth, and in developing his rubbish theory, which was really about how do we categorise waste, with things that are, permanent through to things that are quite ephemeral, and where they sit on that spectrum of value in our lives. But yeah, that's, as I said, I am a bit of a waste nerd, and I love food and cooking and things as well. So I'm always interested in how we utilise our food and understand its uses a whole lot better. And making sure that we get full value out of it, and that we don't waste stuff. So, I have on my kitchen bench a whole lot of avocado plants, because I love avocado, and you always get the avocado seed. What are you going to do with it? Well, we grow more avocados out of it, and they make nice house plants, as it turns out. I'm constantly growing bits of bok choy for more leaves. So,
do you actually get any avocados out of the plants, or is it just a cute little plant?
I haven't had them for long enough to get them there as yet. We probably don't live in the right environment where I live, but they do make a really nice plant. So I've never been too fussed about that. I would love to get one to grow one day. I have to find the right spot for it, though.
Yeah.
But it's a bit of fun.
I know I've occasionally I want to buy seeds from Bunnings to grow food, but I mean, really, why would I do that when I could just take the seeds of the plants I'm not eating, or the plants that I've eaten?
Well, that's right. You can certainly do that. I mean, I always grow my own herbs. I have herb pots and things around the place. The other thing, I mean, from a perspective of getting kids interested in this stuff, have a worm farm. Kids love worm farms, and again, I chop up a lot of fruit and veg stuff into small little bits, so that when it goes into the worm farm, they break down a lot faster. And the worms don't eat the vegetables; they eat the bacteria that grows on them. So the more surface area there is, the more food there is for worms. But, we've always had a worm farm for many, many years. And to be quite honest, you can buy some really nice fancy ones now that look great in the home. And I actually have mine in the kitchen. So it doesn't smell or anything. And, the worm juice provides some great fertiliser for my indoor plants. I have a lot of plants around the place. So, again, it's about, how do we do things that reduce waste or, extend value out of what we're doing, not just eating something, but those little bits, because you can't eat necessarily everything in a plant. Although I've noticed there's a lot more books and things out these days promoting how to use everything quite literally, which is great. I mean, I think it's great knowledge for people to get, and as I talked about with coffee grounds, there's lots of things you can do with coffee grounds. You don't have to throw them out. So it's about extending the value of all of these sorts of things, and doing some fun stuff with it at the same time.
Great. So thank you for coming to the podcast. It was great talking to you.
No problem.
You've been listening to On the House, produced by the Household Management Science Labs, a division of LMSL, the Life Management Science Labs. More episodes like this from across 10 life management perspectives can be found by searching LMSL on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube, and any other podcasting apps available on your smart devices. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider rating, sharing, and subscribing to our channel, as it helps other people to find it so we can grow and continue to bring you quality resources. More of our work can be found on our website, hm.lmsl.net, where you can join our movement. I'm Gabriella Joustra. Thanks for tuning in.